Dr. Jayatilleka, thanks so much for joining us on Connections. I'm going to start off by first asking you, go right into asking you, now the US-led resolution on Sri Lanka has been passed. So how do you think that Sri Lankan state should actually respond to it, and do you think the approach the government is taking now is the right approach?
Well, I don't think the approach has crystallized, and this is only natural because it is a serious situation, and democracies usually take longer to achieve policy cohesion to respond to international crises or international relations problems. So I'm not surprised about that. I think, though, that we can identify a few things that should not be done. There are some responses that are inadvisable. One response, which I do see from a certain element in society, in civil society, even within the political system, is to welcome the resolution as completely harmless and completely benign as not being against Sri Lanka at all. There are those who feel that, well, it may be against the government, but it's not against the country. I think that response is wrong. I think the resolution has to be studied. It is not true that the resolution only asks us to implement our own LLRC proposals. It's not true, because the wording itself says that it expects us to go beyond the LLRC recommendations. So I think the resolution is negative. I think it is potentially dangerous. So I don't think it should be welcome. On the other hand, neither do I think that our response should be one of denial, of saying, now, okay, I mean, who cares? This is not going to affect us in the least. That kind of response, a response of being in denial, is rather like an ostrich policy. Simply because the ostrich hides its head in the sand, it doesn't mean that the lion or the tiger or whatever other predator isn't going to come and jump on it. So I don't think it's wise to be in denial or just shrug it off. Nor do I think it is wise to simply take a posture of isolationism, isolating oneself from the UN system or the international community. I think we must always stay in play, always have a dialogue, though we disagree on principle. So one has to be very realistic. The resolution contains a danger, and that danger must be faced, and it must be overcome. We have to transcend it. We have to understand what the dangers are, and we have to be active and even proactive in meeting those challenges. So I don't think either passivity or welcoming it is wise, nor do I think that simply turning one's back on the Human Rights Council or the resolution or the world is a wise move. These two extremes should be avoided, and at all times a middle path should be chosen.
Okay, but if it is implemented, if the resolution is adhered to, what are the sort of changes do you think we can expect to see, like concrete sort of changes that we can expect to see in the situation in Sri Lanka and the reconciliation process and things like that?
Well, adhering to the resolution is one thing. Responding to the challenge posed by the resolution by adhering to our own reform program is something else, and it is the latter that I recommend. Because the resolution itself says the following. There's a preamble. It's a short resolution. There's a preamble. The preamble says, well, there's this LLRC report which possibly can make a positive contribution to peace in Sri Lanka. Possibly. It does not, there's no applause. It says possibly, which I thought was a little cheeky. And then it says, the LLRC recommendation report has some good recommendation, and it lists what it considers to be positive. That's fine. And then come the three operative clauses, the three main points, the crux of the matter. It notes with concern that the LLRC recommendations do not address adequately so-called issues of international law and violation of international law. Now, that's a code word for these war crimes. Now, that itself is an untruth. because the LLRC report has a thick chapter on the issues of international law. And that's the name of the chapter, it's on international law issues. So it's not true that the LLRC report does not address those. The LLRC report, in fact, lists certain possible crimes which they urge the government to investigate independently. So that's done in the LLRC report. Now, the resolution, as I said, criticizes the report for not doing what it actually does, and then says that the government should present an action plan for the implementation of the LLRC and also the investigation of these alleged crimes against international law. And finally, it calls on the Office of the UN High Commissioner to assist Sri Lanka and for Sri Lanka to accept the assistance and so on and so forth. Now, the danger here is that the resolution, those who brought the resolution and those who pushed the resolution through, by which I mean the more militant elements of the Tamil diaspora, have a certain intention. The intention is this: to prove that Sri Lanka has neither the desire nor the capacity to fulfill an internal national process of reform and reconciliation and accountability. They're trying to prove that point. And if that point is proved, and that point can be proved only by us not doing anything. If they prove that point, then this resolution will be revisited and it will be added on to, and they will say, look, Sri Lanka was given a chance, it didn't do anything, therefore we must have an international independent inquiry mechanism. And then you know, they will have an embellished report which makes the Darusman report look like a nursery rhyme, and they will use that against Sri Lanka. Now, this is the trap that is being set for us. So I think it is extremely unwise for us to ignore that and say, oh, who cares? I mean, this is no bearing on us, and we're not going to take it seriously at all. We should take it seriously, not to salute and comply, but to get out of this trap that is being set for us. And to do that, we should implement our own nationally generated program of reform, reconciliation, and accountability. We have that. Okay. We have to do that. We shouldn't go 1 inch beyond it, not 1 inch beyond it.
Okay, so, but anyway, the LLRC, as you mentioned, is one of the main features, or they're calling for the full implementation of the LLRC. But there's been...
And going beyond.
Yeah, and going beyond. But there are also, like, 3 months after it had been released, there have been varied statements about what is going to be implemented or what is not, and there is not a sort of official stance, so we are not very sure about what the government is actually going to do. So could you kindly comment on that? How do you think it should be fully implemented? If not, what clauses of the report should be implemented?
Well, I think the answer to that was contained 2 days ago on the front page of the Island in the lead story. And the lead story was very, very interesting. It was a statement by the ambassador of a country that has stood by Sri Lanka for decades in war and in peace, and including in Geneva, 2009, 2012, and that is the Russian Federation. The ambassador of the Russian Federation to Colombo, Mr. Mikhailov, I believe, His Excellency Mikhailov, had clearly and unambiguously stated that Sri Lanka should implement the LLRC report. Now, this is not the United States. This is one of our key friends, and I say key friends because it is one of our supporters, our guarantors in the UN Security Council as well. And when this friend says this, I completely agree with him. I've been saying this independently before. We should implement the LLRC proposals in their entirety. Obviously it cannot be done overnight, but there should be, like we had once the accelerated Mahavali, an accelerated program of reforms, not because the Human Rights Council has said it, but because we have lost 30 years by not doing these things. We have been an independent country for 64 years. Think of it as a human being, you know. And of the 64 years, half has been spent among other things, butchering each other.
Okay, so have
A tremendous loss of life.
Okay.
So, I mean, these are things that we should have done, which we didn't do, and we have to catch up for lost time, and we have to catch up in the 21st century. So we should implement the LLRC report and all the provisions of our own constitution, our basic law, in all parts of the country as soon as we possibly can. And as I said, we shouldn't go an inch beyond that.
Okay.
And then we can face the Human Rights Council, the UN system, the whole world, and say, look, we've done what we think we should do, which has been recommended to us by our own commissions, by our own constitution, and we have proven that we are willing, able, and keen on reform and a new post-war order in Sri Lanka, a better order.
Okay, but has the government now come to a sort of consensus that it is going to fully implement the LLRC? Or is there still divided sort of opinions on that?
I mean, if you look around the world, you would see that in every democracy, and I say democracy because if it's a non-democracy, you really can't see what's going on. But even on a small thing, like should India vote for or against the resolution, or should it abstain? I mean, we saw that the Indian government, I mean, there were so many views in the Indian coalition, and all of this was on Indian television. So it took a while and many ups and downs for even a big power like India to arrive at a consensus within its government on something that was relatively small. How do you vote at the UN Human Rights Council? Now, I'm not surprised, therefore, that in Sri Lanka, which is also, I mean, essentially, fundamentally, basically a democracy, and a democracy in which you have a ruling coalition with a diversity of views, I'm not surprised that that seems to be more than one view, and that it's taking a little time for it to crystallize in terms of a cohesive policy response. So this is, in a way, natural. But there is another deeper issue here. Any society which has been through 30 years of war, especially if it's a civil war, comes out of that dark tunnel and blinks because it's not used to being in the light after 30 years in tunnel of war. And habits are difficult to overcome. Structures are difficult to dismantle. Normality is not easy to restore. So you have a hangover, as it were, of mentalities of the war, of ways of seeing things, of ways of looking at things, of ways of responding to things. You need to make a huge shift, and that's not always easy, to make the transition from 30 years of war to a sustainable peace. And we are in that transition, and there are different projects, there are different views on what post-war Sri Lanka should be like, how different should it be from pre-war Sri Lanka, in which direction. There are debates, there are discrepancies, there are contradictions, there are perhaps even conflicts. And this is one of the reasons, perhaps, why you don't find a very clear and swift, coherent policy response.
Okay, so but
that's the reality.
Going back to one section you mentioned in the LLRC report, you said there's a huge section dedicated to violations that took place during the final stages of the war, and they also called for further investigations into that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how
they have listed some incidents.
Yeah. So how do you think, like, if these, when these investigations do take place, how do you think they should take place? So what's the framework or the mechanism that should be in place for it to take place credibly, both locally as well as internationally?
Well, the LLRC report has called for independent inquiry, and we have to be very careful here because there is a propaganda effort to show the world that you cannot have an independent inquiry in Sri Lanka, that the only independent inquiry has to be international. There are some who are trying to do that. And that is why this resolution is structured in such a way that we have been given a chance to prove or disprove that case. We have been given a chance to implement what our own commission has recommended, which is an independent inquiry into incident ABCD. Now, I think we should do what the commission says and show the world that an independent inquiry can be done domestically, nationally. I mean, as far as the specific mechanisms of it, I would rather the commissioners themselves, the LLRC commissioners themselves, be asked, if at all, to draw up a sort of the methodologies or suggest some options. This is something they would probably be the best position to do because they drafted the report. And perhaps one should go back to them and ask for their views as to how specifically this might be done.
Okay.
But as a general proposition, this is of course a good idea. But I also have to say this as a student of politics. In many countries, the issue of accountability can be tackled only a long time after a war is over. Just 2 weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, 7 soldiers in Guatemala were sentenced to 6,700 years in prison concerning a massacre that they perpetrated in 1982. In 1982. In Brazil, it is only now, as we speak, that there is a commission of inquiry into acts committed during the military regime of 1964 to 1984. So it takes time because most societies do not want to reopen wounds and kind of relive traumas. So we have to understand that that aspect of the LLRC recommendations, the LLRC has not recommended a time frame. I would say far more important, and the bulk of the LLRC recommendations are about rectifying the problems in our society which led to 30 years of war. Their suggestions are about constructing a different and better Sri Lanka in a way of, may I say, to renegotiate the social contract. And they have suggested a number of reforms so that all citizens can feel that they are truly equal, that there is no discrimination, that there can be integration of all into our society, that a Sri Lankan nation can truly be built. I see the LLRC recommendations as a roadmap for nation building. And this is the real strength and value of the LLRC.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think if we do that, if we engage in ethnic reconciliation as proposed by the LLRC, then the issue of accountability, which is a little more difficult, can take its own natural time, as it does in many other societies.
Okay, but speaking about the issue of accountability and investigations, hasn't the government set up a military tribunal? Is it still in place? And how do you...
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. From what I've read,
so,
there is most countries have an internal process. I mean, there was an American soldier who massacred 16 Afghan civilians, and he was put on a plane and sent back to the United States. I'm not even sure whether he has still been charged. I mean, maybe he has, but I'm not sure. Initially, it will be by the military tribunal itself in the United States. If you take Britain, there was a famous, infamous massacre, really, of Bloody Sunday in 1972 in Londonderry. All those who died were civilians. The civilians, were not armed. On the other side, there were paratroopers. And it took 36 years and 2 commissions to come up with any kind of report. And none of those people, as far as I know, have been locked up. So, when we are preached to, we should also look at those who do the preaching. So, in the first instance, yes, these things have to be investigated by the military itself. But society decides on the mechanism of investigation and how to, address these issues of accountability without tearing ourselves apart. Because, if we start going down that road, the question is going to arise, okay, where do you stop? I mean, why stop at the last few weeks of the war? What about the whole of the 30 Years' War? What about the Anuradhapura massacre? Then somebody says, what about July 83? Then someone else says, what about Arantala or Habarana? I mean, who decides who's going to stop? So I would say that it is a much better strategy to address the nation-building reforms. The reforms which are to do with reconciliation between all communities in Sri Lanka, which the LLRC has identified. These are the problems, these are the recommendations. I mean, let's do that. and build, start rebuilding or building a new sense of nationhood, and then we will be in a much better position to face the challenges that this resolution and maybe even the next one will pose to Sri Lanka.
Okay, so coming back now to the vote on the US-led resolution, I think it was in one of your interviews, it was maybe with, I think it was with BBC Sandesh, you said that Myanmar was defeated in a vote that was brought in on the UN Human Rights Council in 2009. So there is nothing leveled against the country now because it's changing. So do you think that those who voted against the resolution in 2009, some of those countries voted in favor of it this year? Do you think that happened because they didn't see any change in those last 3 years?
Well, you know, there's a famous, probably the most famous academic on international affairs living today, that's Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University, who coined the term soft power. Soft power is different from hard power. Hard power is military force. And he says, you know, you mustn't think that you can win just because you have hard power, that you can, you know, just that you can coerce people. In order for a country or state to succeed, says Professor Joe Nye, you need a combination of hard power, that is military power in reserve, and soft power, which is the ability to convince and to attract.
Okay.
And he says the combination of the two is smart power. So I think that our reserve in Geneva in 2009, obviously we had the soft power and we were able to wield it. Maybe we had a little smart power too. And we won. And we won very handsomely because even today, where the United States, the sole superpower, with the vote of India, has managed to get 24 votes. When in 2009, when I was privileged to present our resolution to the same council, different composition of the council, we won 29 votes. We did better than the US has done now. Okay. But obviously there has been an erosion in our soft power. And when you lose an election, whether it's in the Human Rights Council or anywhere else, or, you know, in the municipality, it's because you haven't been able to convince a sufficient number of people with what you're saying, that what you're saying is good enough or true enough or right or beneficial or whatever. That's how elections are lost. The other side does better because they have been able to convince or attract that many voters.
Okay.
Now, Geneva 2009 remains the only election in an international arena that we have won for a long time, so there are lessons to be learned from that election. Now, Professor Nye says that for a country to prevail, it depends on whose story wins. I repeat that. Whose story wins. It's not who wins the war. I mean, it's important to win a war, but the final outcome, he says, depends on whose story wins, whose narrative wins. Now, he's from Harvard University. There's somebody else at the other end of the spectrum, Fidel Castro, who has said the same thing before, and using a different phrase, he talks about the battle of ideas. So, obviously, Sri Lanka has not been able to win the battle of narratives, the battle of stories, or, if you want to use Fidel's phrase, the battle of ideas, which is why we lost in Geneva. So, of course, there are powerful forces arrayed against us, the two Channel 4 films, and so on and so forth. But from 2009 to 2012, in the global battle of ideas, we have not prevailed, obviously. Now, this is a serious matter because we have to, government propaganda, you know, just won't do it. In any case, you must know how to convince people, and the only way to do that is to tell the truth and to say it with credibility. We have to win the battle of arguments and the battle of stories. Our story, our narrative, which has to be truthful, against the narrative that is now flowing throughout global public opinion. Boutros Ghali, a former Secretary General of the United Nations, said at UNESCO, where I represent Sri Lanka, he said that there is a new superpower in the world, and that is global public opinion. Sri Lanka has yet to realize this. You can't fight this battle and prevail with an attitude that we don't care about the rest of the world. I mean, I once wrote that mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all is not the best methodology in fighting this battle in the international arena. Okay. Self-satisfaction is just not good enough.
Okay, so but in addition to that, do you think that if Sri Lanka as a state had done more in those 3 years, that we would have been able to swing that vote?
Well, 3 months before, well actually about a year before we won the war, I had been writing about winning locally, winning globally, winning the war, winning the peace. That there are too many countries which have won wars but have not won the peace. I gave the example of Israel in 1967, which had this brilliant six-day war, historic, brilliant military victory, but now for 40 years it's been bogged down because it has wasted the opportunities of that brilliant victory. So I've been predicting this and saying, even at our moment of highest achievement, that we have to have a clear conception of a better Sri Lanka. A Sri Lanka that is better than the one that gave rise to the war. And from 2009, after our Geneva victory, I didn't rest on those laurels. I kept writing that this is what we must do. This is why these countries supported us in Geneva, these 29 countries. These are our friends. If we are to keep this global coalition together, we must fulfill the promises that we have made and the promise that Sri Lanka holds out, the promise of peace and prosperity and equity. And I said those things at that time, and I warned that if we do not do this, our neighbor will turn and our coalition will break up and the international space we have will shrink. And I'm sorry to say that I was proven right. Now, having said those things and made those predictions and pushed for the sort of reforms that the LLRC is now talking about, I think I paid the price because I was what happened after our victory in Geneva in 2009 was that a couple of weeks later I was recalled. I mean, I was fired basically, having helped win the resolution, the battle in May 2009, but having expressed my views on how we should go forward and not run the risk of losing. That is supposed to be one of the reasons for which I was inexplicably and arbitrarily removed from Geneva.
Okay. Okay, here's one last question, sir. You said that we could learn some lessons from Myanmar in the same interview. So what do you think we should specifically learn from them, and what do you think we should like immediately or speedily sort of implement? Yes. Now,
there's obviously been some problem of comprehension on the part of certain people, because I'm told that on a television program, and not on your channel, somebody, without naming me, a Sinhalese language program, and said, there are our diplomats who are saying that we should be like Myanmar. How dare they compare Sri Lanka with Myanmar? And is this what diplomats are doing now, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, I wasn't saying that Sri Lanka is like Myanmar. I mean, Sri Lanka has never been a military dictatorship. We've been an established democracy during our entire existence. But after the shock of the Geneva defeat, it came as a shock to me, but not a surprise, because I predicted this. Everybody's been looking around, quite rightly, for ways out, for solutions, for responses. And I've heard, some people talk about Israel, some talk about Cuba. Now, I don't think anybody is equating us with Israel and saying, obviously we're not building walls separating peoples. So I don't think that somebody's saying we are like Israel. No, they're trying to derive some example and inspiration from what they think is some sort of role model. Now, I don't think the others mean that we are like Cuba, that we are a revolutionary state. We are not. But they derive some inspiration and example from Cuba. Now, my response was, look, there's an example that's even closer to us. Because unlike Israel, we are not a nuclear power. Unlike Israel, we are not the most powerful military entity in the entire region, in our neighborhood. And unlike Israel, we do not have an open-ended commitment from a superpower. And we are not like Cuba, obviously. I mean, we are not a revolutionary state. So I said, look, Myanmar, it's an Asian society. I would also remind viewers that it has a Theravada Buddhist cultural matrix, as we do. So it's not sort of a Western example. And Myanmar was under far, far greater pressure than Sri Lanka is today and possibly will be. There are still residual sanctions against Myanmar. But Myanmar has escaped from these encirclements. There are only, as I said, residues or trappings or echoes of the international pressure against Myanmar. How did it do so? Apart from what I've read and seen on television, it's also the case that the present foreign minister of Myanmar was my colleague, counterpart, and friend when I served in Geneva in 2009. I mean, we used to sit together and support each other. So I'm privy to some of the thinking that went in to what has happened in Myanmar. The way they got out of this international encirclement and incredible international pressure was by reforming themselves. Because finally, I mean, this is something one learns from the great philosophy of Buddhism as well. By oneself is one defiled. I mean, you can control only your own responses. You cannot, for instance, Sri Lanka cannot control what happens in Tamil Nadu or India or Washington or Beijing or whatever. You can't. We can try to influence it, but we can try to influence it only by doing that which we can do, and that is to change within ourselves, to turn the searchlight inward, as the Buddha always advocated. Now, Myanmar did that. It turned the searchlight inward. It underwent a process of change that is incredible. I mean, it democratized. It's still far behind Sri Lanka, of course, but it democratized. It engaged in political dialogue. It had a radically new sort of democratic opening. It released political prisoners. It's having elections. It opened up. It liberalized. It's normalized. And what is the result? Next year, 2013, Myanmar is going to be the honored chairperson of one of the most prestigious and successful international organizations in the whole world, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Myanmar is the chair next year. I mean, what a tremendous turnaround. And that is by internal, nationally generated political will, not to just be stubborn and hang tough and so on. No, the Myanmaris never caved in to the West. But they didn't stay static and frozen and paralyzed either. They didn't just wait for somebody to come and get them. They moved very flexibly, very fast. They outmaneuvered their foes and their critics and their adversaries. They outmaneuvered them. They outthought them, outstrategized them, and outmaneuvered them, and they pretty much cleaned up their act. I mean, if you want to go colloquial, Myanmar cleaned up its act drastically. So I'm saying, look, that's an example. That's a method of how you respond to tremendous international pressure and even hostility. You clean up your act. And that's the one thing you can do. I mean, you don't need anybody else to clean up your act. And you prove that you don't need anyone else, any outsider, by cleaning up your act yourself. But you clean it up thoroughly. And you engage in reform and reconciliation. Myanmar engaged in a lot of internal reconciliation. And that's the way that we should go. This is why I resorted to Myanmar as an example of a successful response to international pressure and interference.
Okay. Dr. Jayatilleka, I think that's all the time we have for this interview. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been very interesting talking about the resolution, implementation of the LLRC, basically how we should move forward as a nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.